suspects are being. One case involves the FBI is now offering $100,000 to see for the police are releasing.
Welcome to Misty Mysteries, a paranormal and true crime podcast. The 2004 TV show Ghost Hunters, featuring the TAPS team, caused an increase in paranormal investigation teams around the United States. And not only in paranormal investigation groups, but an increase in paranormal investigation shows. Most groups and shows also don't charge the places or people they are investigating. For that reason, many do it as a hobby or side project. This week, I'm going to tell you all about a shadow figure that just might be an omen of death. Have you heard of Anchor? Anchor is the easiest way to make a podcast. When I started Misty Mysteries, I didn't know where to go, and Anchor helped me get Misty Mysteries started without charging me an arm and a leg. Anchor is really my suggestion for anyone looking to start a podcast. It has tools that allow you to record and edit in-app or on the website. Anchor distributes your podcasts on all the listening places such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Good Pods, and all your favorite listening places. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place, and best of all, it's totally free, all on Anchor FM and on the Anchor app. One night, a woman was laying in her bed listening to a podcast, and she was just feeling herself drift in and out of sleep when she felt the room get heavy. She had a feeling someone or something was watching her. It felt dark. She looked over to the window of her room when she saw a shadow of a tall man wearing a hat standing by her bed watching her. She took a picture, but when she looked back at the picture, there was no man. There was just a picture of a solid black figure wearing a coat and a top hat. What the woman didn't realize is she had seen an entity called the Hat Man. The Hat Man is described as a shadow person, but isn't, considering he comes in more of a human form than other shadow people. Hat Man is 6 to 10 feet tall. He seems to be dressed in a long trench coat with a hat that some report as a top hat, fedora, or a gaucho hat. He appears to some with glowing red eyes and to some with a featureless face. People are woken up to the figure standing in doorways, closets, corners of rooms, hovering over them in bed, and or hunched over them staring at them sleeping with a smile on his face. The Hat Man doesn't just haunt one area. There are stories of him from all over the world. In 2004, a 19-year-old soldier was living at home with his father in Quebec, Canada. At 3 a.m., he was watching TV and just drifting in and out of sleep when he heard his back door open. The bars closed at 3 a.m., so he figured the door was his dad. When he called out, "Dad," he heard the footsteps coming towards the entrance of his door, at the rate that no human could walk. He then saw him standing in the doorway. The Hat Man was as tall as the doorway, and he saw him smile at him. The young man felt paralyzed in fear with dread of death. The Hat Man then leaped onto the young man. The young man felt his hands on his shoulders. He closed his eyes to pray, and when he opened them again, the Hat Man was gone, and he could move again. The Hat Man doesn't just haunt all over the world. Some stories and people have reported him haunting with spirits and shadow people. A Reddit user named Their Eyes Upon You tells a story of a traumatic experience they had with Hat Man at the age of 18. They remember waking up around 2 to 3 a.m. with an odd feeling. They were speaking a different language they had never heard before, to what they described as a young 14-year-old shadow person in a girl figure. The only thing visible in the girl was her mouth and her eyes, which they were described as sharp like a piranha. She was whispering in the ear with a foreign language, and they were replying back in that same language. When they looked around the bed, there were 4 other figures surrounding the bed, standing motionless, watching them sleep. What they remember most was a tall shadow figure with a wide-brimmed hat standing in the corner of the room watching this all happen. With every reply, the woman remembered the Hat Man being entertained and smirking, almost laughing. The user recalls other people that they spoke to had very similar encounters, like this, but without the talking girl. The Hat Man has connections to families from generation to generation, from grandparents to parents to their children will see the Hat Man. He follows people from childhood and sometimes even through their whole lives. But what exactly is he? Hat Man is called different things. From a demon, since many people see him during sleep paralysis, and he appears in people's lives during times of trauma and bad living situations. He likes to watch them almost as if feeding off of their fear and negative energy. He can also be compared to a shadow person, since he is seen in the same form and many times with other shadow people. He is also named as a reaper. The Hat Man has appeared many times, weeks or days before something bad happens or people pass away. There is a photo taken of 3 women in front of their home, and in the photo, a tall, dark figure of a man with a hat appears behind them. The 3 women passed away in a car accident later that same day. A woman has a very similar story to this. When she was a little girl, she had an older neighbor. One day she remembered seeing a tall shadow man with a top hat and an umbrella standing outside of her elder neighbor's home in their lawn. The man noticed her and he turned to wave at her. He then walked down the street. The next day, her neighbor had passed away. The Hat Man has been seen by so many all over the world, leaving questions where he goes. When I was in high school, I had my own personal experience with what I thought would be a Hat Man. When I was around 16 years old, I started to wake up at 3:30 a.m., feeling watched. I lived in my grandparents' old house, and half my bedroom was for storage. I looked into the corner of my room, and I would see darkness. It wasn't until a month later, I started to wake up to see a tall man, about 7 feet tall, with a fedora, dressed in a suit with a trench coat, standing at the edge of my bed. The best way to explain him would be dressed like very nice, almost mobster in a way. A spirit that has protected me my whole life would stand between me and him, and he would just stand there smiling at me. This was something I experienced almost every night for months, till my mother banished him from our home. He then would stand outside my window on a hill at night. Being afraid of him, I would close my curtains before the sun even went down, and wouldn't open them till morning. I have only seen him one more time since leaving that house, and that was after listening to a Hat Man episode of another podcast. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Misty Mysteries. If you like the podcast, please share with friends and family on social media. Speaking of social media, you can find the podcast on places like Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Please leave a good review for the podcast on places like Apple Podcasts and Podchasers. You can also find the podcast on a place called Buy Me a Coffee, where you can support the podcast and get yourself shouted out on the podcast, or with a membership, you can get your name shouted out on the podcast with so many more benefits. You can find the podcast on listening places such as Spotify, Anchor, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and so many more. As always, my sources can be found in the episode description, and I'll see you on Wednesday.